Hello, everyone. We're just going to get started in just a moment and give people a couple of minutes to join the Zoom call. Stay tuned. There's a quick update. We're going to start in just a minute. Stay tuned. All right, I think it's time. We have a couple more people joining the stream, but thank you everyone for joining us today. We have Michael with us. He's a director at Improving here at Improving and part of the Calgary enterprise. With over 20 years of experience as an architect, team lead, and mentor. Focusing primarily on Microsoft technologies, Michael has designed and built software solutions spanning scalable cloud-based systems to web and mobile applications for companies ranging from startups to large enterprises. Beyond his tech endeavors, Michael's an enthusiast of traveling, golfing, snowboarding, and mountain biking. And before I hand it off to you, Michael, I just want to let you guys, our viewers, know that if you have any questions at any point, please put them in the chat. If you're on our website, I'll be monitoring the chat box there. If you're using the Zoom client, you can post them either in the Q&A feature located on the bottom of your screen or the chat box as well. It should be enabled for everyone. But again, thank you for joining us. And without further ado, Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Jordan. Hey, everyone. I hope today's going well for everyone here. And yeah, let's kind of just get into it. So I'm just going to share my screen here and be sure everybody can see this. And so, today we're going to talk about GitHub Copilot. Actually, doesn't seem to be displaying. Can everybody see this? Okay, I think this is better.
Yeah, I do see your screen.
Okay. Yeah, so we're going to talk about GitHub Copilot, kind of walk through this and tabulate to success, possibly. We'll see what happens, right? But, basically today we're going to talk about, what is it? Just in terms like what the heck is Copilot? If you haven't had a chance to use it, I would strongly suggest checking it out. And we're going to look at, just like if you played around with ChatGPT or other sort of large language models, right? How the context that goes into Copilot and the prompts, we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit to see how Copilot works. If anyone has actually kind of played around with it before and want to share some experience, feel free to jump in, right? Because, this is still relatively new and there's a lot of interesting things that come out of this, but by all means, feel free to jump into the chat to share your experiences. And then we're going to get into a demo. The demo, I think, is kind of fun, mainly because we're dealing with AI and it's going to be a live demo. And sometimes you get some pretty interesting things happening. Let's cross our fingers, hope it goes okay, but we'll just totally have some fun with this. And then, maybe as time permits, we'll get into kind of what's down the road with GitHub Copilot X. Okay. So first things first, what is it? So GitHub Copilot, is kind of coined your paired programmer assistant. But really it's a generative AI coding tool that is really a productivity booster, right? And what it does is, here's the logo. It kind of lives inside of your IDE, right? And the currently supported IDEs, I believe, are VS Code, Visual Studio. Most of the JetBrains suite is supported, if not all. NeoVim, and I've started to use it in Azure Data Studio as well. And yeah, so it's a little guy that kind of lives in there, a little plugin or a little extension. And what it does is, as you're kind of working with it, it's going to send snippets of project code out to the large language model, right? And this is like something that's trained just for coding. And I kind of visualize these things as, some sort of computerized brain in the cloud, right? So there's my lovely little image there. And so it's going to take some code and it's going to try to give you back some suggestions, right? So at a super high level, that's what's happening inside of your IDE as you use GitHub Copilot. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that there's a bit of a privacy concern because your code is actually leaving your desktop and going somewhere else, right? The brain in the cloud. So, if you're gonna use this, you want to make sure that your company's on board and everyone kind of understands, what's happening. But at another super high level, there's basically two kinds of licenses. There's, a personal license and more of a business related license. The personal license, from what I understand, is when your code goes up there so that it can give you suggestions, it's actually used to train the model, right? To become a little bit smarter. So if you have some sort of, proprietary IP, that could actually be going out to train a model. Now, on the other side, if you have a business license, it apparently is not used to train models, and it's kind of more transient in nature, where the code is just sent up. The giant brain in the cloud will process it and give you some answers back. But the key point here is, if you are going to use it, make sure the company is on board. Okay, so let's kind of get into this kind of idea of context or prompts. So when we kind of talk about this, right, I got a little chat GPT kind of thing here. I'm like, hopefully everyone's kind of playing around with that, kind of experimenting, because the same idea is kind of baked into Copilot, where, if you play with chat GPT, how you ask a question significantly influences the responses that you get back from these large language models, right? So within Copilot, you're not necessarily asking things. You got your project, you got your code, and it's like, how does that information kind of go out to provide suggestions? And I'm just going to give kind of a quick little sample and a run through of some of the things that it uses to provide that context. Okay, so here, what we have is, a simple C# domain object, and it represents a playlist, right? So they think of Spotify, Apple Music, whatever you have. And, it's got a name with a bunch of songs in it, where we can add songs and remove songs. Can only change state through these methods, all those kind of good programming practices. But, we're kind of going to walk through some of the things that are going on here that Copilot does, and how you can help it with context and prompts to get hopefully better answers. So the first thing that it is going to use is your current file, right? Because there is actually a limited amount of information. the amount of code that can actually be sent to these models, right? So you can't take your entire project, distill it down and say, okay, based off of everything I see in your project, this is the suggestion I'm going to give you, so, but it's going to start with your current file. Comments, and comments are kind of interesting. So, this is kind of where you may throw some comments right inside your file, just to kind of give a hint to Copilot at what you're doing. So for example, I just put at the top, this is a playlist domain object with read-only properties of ID, name, and songs. And, it basically cranked out most of this code for me. And the other kind of comment that I threw in here is I started this method saying add song, and it didn't check for any duplicates. So I added the comment, check for duplicates. And the context that it provided and sent it out, it actually suggested this line of code that makes sure that when we add a song for a playlist, we don't allow any duplicates. So it's kind of interesting. So it's almost like it really changes the mindset of how you might develop if you use Copilot as your paired programmer. You can get into that idea of comment-driven development, or write some specifications based off of your current stories, right? And it will help you actually produce the code. The idea of fill in the middle. So remember, as we're kind of working, it's like, how do we tweak things, and how does Copilot tweak things so that it sends up the proper amount of information to influence the response? It has this idea of fill in the middle. And I was reading a little bit of history on this, and it was kind of interesting. When it first started, it actually only looked at the current file, and it only looked at information before the cursor. And, of course, over time, they realized, well, it's not really how you code, right? It's like, you kind of got to look at where you are in the file. You got to look at information before and information after, and try to fill in the middle. They're trying to guess what's going to happen in the middle, right? So this idea of what comes before and what comes after is also important. And they introduce something. Now, personally, I haven't seen a lot of success in this, but apparently it's there, is the idea of neighboring tabs. So most IDEs, right, you're going to have a number of tabs or a number of files that represent code that you're working on. So you'll notice up here, I have another file or another tab open called song. And because I'm actually working in this file, I'm going to open up that tab, and maybe it will help produce better results. And function names, right? Make your function names very descriptive. It's going to interpret them just as it would any other, like, readable, like good programming practices. But because it is like a, natural language processing based system, if you kind of get something that's a little bit more meaningful, it will definitely be able to interpret it and understand what you're doing. So for example, I said add song, and you'll notice here, we're going to see Copilot in action, where I'm going to say, oh, by the way, I started typing in remove song. And you see, this is an example of Copilot and its little, ghostwriter, where it's going to make a suggestion saying, okay, I know what you've done. You've done an add song. So if I type in remove, it's automatically going to say, hey, I think you want to remove a song. It's going to understand, the signature and the syntax. It knows that, song has an ID. Hopefully it's because it's either seen this before the cursor on the current file, or it's reached into this neighboring tab, right? But the way it's kind of providing that context is pretty interesting. But yeah, this is Copilot right here in action. And when I see this kind of pop up, as you can see in the live demo, I can either tab, or I can hit escape, right? To actually say, it's not really what I want, so I'm not going to do that. The other thing, be consistent and be predictable, right? The more you're kind of following, and this is just general, typical coding kind of standards, like as you do things, right? you're kind of going to follow your own little pattern, or the you know, the team's patterns, right? Where naming conventions, things that are kind of named the same, consistent, predictable, will kind of help, you know, Copilot send information and provide suggestions back. And I'm sure there's a whack of others, you know, but overall, this is kind of how, you know, without us being able to necessarily ask some questions to influence how, you know, Copilot will respond and give some answers back. We can do some things in our files to actually do that, you know, as opposed to ChatGPT, where it's just a giant text box and you're just kind of going back and forth chatting. Okay, hope that made a little bit of sense, and we're going to see this in action as we go. Okay, I'm going to share my experience. This is kind of fun. So, you know, a couple of years ago, and I was actually talking with Jordan before this to kind of see what his experience was too. And I'm sure anyone who's used it has their own experience of it. But I'll tell you my experience. So a couple of years ago, right, when this first was kind of being announced, and it was in, like, you know, the early stages of this before ChatGPT, you know, you could sign up. And so I signed up and waited, you know, eagerly anticipated them to let me in. And so finally I got in, and I was so excited, got it ramped up, got it using it. And it was kind of like, yeah, this is kind of what I thought. I was like, yeah. I was like, I don't quite get it. You know, could be me, you know, could be, there's all kinds of interesting things. It's kind of just getting in the way. It's kind of annoying. It's you know, wrecking my development flow. But, you know, so uninstalled it and said, not for me. And then, of course, you know, like everything else that kind of happens, you know, the beginning of January, right? Like ChatGPT, or like end of last year, right? November, December timeframe, ChatGPT's release kind of put you know, the world on its side a little bit, right? And so I started playing around with that again, and, you know, could see some of the code that thing was cranking out, and I'm like, oh, okay, I better try this again, and probably, you know, try to change my habits and force myself to use it, because I don't think it's going away. And like I said, it can be a big productivity booster for sure. So installed it, got on, you know, got a business license, went ahead and did it. And, you know, the first thing I kind of noticed that I alluded to before is, you know, like most of the IDs I use are JetBrains related, right? And which are pretty good tools. And they can do a lot. So there's this bit of a battle happening between Copilot and your IDE, because your IDE is actually pretty smart and wants to give you a bunch of suggestions too. So, you know, as I committed to this and I forced myself to use it, I had to kind of tweak some settings, and I don't think I quite got it, you know, to where I officially like it, but I did have to turn some things off inside of my IDE to let Copilot do its thing. But that's the first thing you're going to know. And this is that kind of thing. Well, I think it's getting in the way, right? Because it is kind of ruining my flow a little bit. The other thing I've noticed as I've used this, you know, there's kind of me in the middle, right? Bunch of options, bunch of things, you know, typically walking around with, okay, now what do I do? How should I use this stuff? I jump around in a lot of technology stacks. So, you know, if I kind of look at the way I used to develop and the way I'm kind of developing now with this little forward arrow here, you know, these icons or these images kind of dictate, you know, the size of them dictate my usage. And it's actually probably even less now, right? Whereas before, if I was trying to figure out stuff, go to Chrome, go to the web, just kind of Google away. Stack Overflow is my buddy, right? And when you get stuck, and I'm really seeing a pattern now where I'm leaning heavily on Copilot and ChatGPT. And we're actually going to see this now. If I had to, I probably should have revamped these images, but this ChatGPT is now even lower because, and we're going to see this in the demo. So there's GitHub Copilot, and then there's another feature called GitHub Copilot Chat, which was just released in preview. And so I've been working with that for about, I don't know, a month now. And essentially it replaces ChatGPT and it lives right inside your development environment. And so, yeah, anything that I would use this for now is almost gone now that Copilot Chat has been released. And we're going to get to that a little bit, but I'm definitely seeing a trend now that I've forced myself to use Copilot, and it's way less on this side, way more on this side. Okay, what are we doing for time? Okay, let's get into the demo. This is the good stuff. Okay, so I chose to do a visual demo, right or wrong, not really sure the audience, but just in case, here's kind of what we're going to try to do. Not too stunning, but we're going to do a little web app in React and TypeScript, do some styling with styled components. But really what it is we're going to create this layout page. We're going to have navigation on the left, content on the right, and a footer that spans the bottom. Okay. And this is just to give you a little bit of context as we go through this demo. You may not be familiar with, some web things. So, just to give you an idea. And what we're going to do is we're going to use CSS grid layout to, produce this layout. And I find the syntax a little weird personally, right? A little different, but the grid, deals with rows. So you see I have 2 rows and 2 columns, okay? And it deals with templated areas or area names. So we're actually going to name these areas, and we're going to hopefully Copilot's going to help us with all of the gory CSS grid layout stuff. Like as I mentioned, we're going to use styled components. If you've never used this before, it's really another CSS in JS library. And yeah, just to kind of give a quick little snippet, and it's kind of weird syntax, right? You write some JavaScript, it's got these magical little ticks here, and we're going to say, hey, we want our background to be hot pink, which who doesn't? And in the end, what it's going to do is it's going to generate a classic CSS class from this code, right? Still going to obey the laws of the browser. But the point is to kind of, what we want to do is, as we use Copilot, is not necessarily a styled components lesson. It's just to kind of say, Copilot understands a lot of things, and it can really help us do our work. Okay. All right, let us get into our codes. So what we have is, this is just a simple little app that's been scaffolded. Where is it? Okay, here it is. Doesn't really do anything, right? And we're going to try to create that layout. Okay, so given everything we kind of learned so far, I'm going to type in some stuff, and you guys are going to probably understand why I love Copilot, because I am a horrible typer, and anything that can help me, I'm really going to enjoy it. So let's just kind of describe this. This is the layout. No, see, it's just Copilot's trying to guess this. Oh, and I should mention, once you install, so I'm using VS Code. And once you install this, you're going to get a little Copilot guide down here. And when it's thinking, it's going to give us a little spinner. Okay. So as I'm kind of typing away, you're going to see it's trying to guess even my comments, right? So I'm going to say this is the layout of the app. With navigation on the left, content in the middle. I didn't really like where it was going with that, so I'm not going to use it. In the middle, and what did we say? We wanted and footer on the bottom. Let's say spanning the entire width of the page. Okay, so I'm going to accept that. So remember, as I said, context, what we're trying to do is give this, give Copilot some hints to help us out. And let's see, we'll use CSS grid and style components. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of seed this page to kind of give us a hint from Copilot, and we're going to break some rules here. I'm going to slap everything in this index page, so a little bit of single responsibility might be broken. So please don't judge me. Okay, so it's immediately saying, hey, I think you want to import React. I don't really need that anymore, so I'm not going to do that. But I'm just going to get the ball rolling with this thing. Okay, so right here, I'm going to say const shell. I'm going to create my shell React component and kind of recognize this is going into functional world. I like where it's going. I'm going to tab my way to success. And this is kind of weird. I don't really like what it's doing. I'm kind of hitting some keystrokes. You can't really see this, but when it gives some options, you can actually rotate through other options that it might give you. So I'm hitting the option square bracket, right? Not really doing anything. So you know what? I don't really like where that's going. So I'm just going to ignore that. And oh, I like this. This is a good starting point for me. Okay, and we're gonna so right here we have our IDE kind of competing with Copilot, and I'm gonna escape that and I'm gonna let Copilot do its thing. Okay, so all we've done here is say, hey, let's have a show. I'm gonna start to train Copilot to get familiar with what I want to do. And remember, I want to use style components, and I'm going to start a bit of a pattern. So any of my kind of divvy things, I'm going to say, hey, it's the component with a container wrapped in a div. And automatically it's going, hey, do you want styled div, right? And this is the syntax, doesn't really matter. But the most important part here is that from a CSS standpoint, this thing recognized already that I want to use CSS grid because I kind of told it, right? And it's saying, hey, I want to display grid versus, let's say, flex. Okay, remember I said we had 2 columns, and based off of my description, this kind of looks right. Once again, syntax wise, I can't necessarily remember all this, but I'm dangerous enough to know this is what I want. I want to make the 1 column a little bit wider. And template rows completely got wrong. I only wanted 2 rows, but you know what? I'm going to take this anyway. And actually columns. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the first row, I want a little bit bigger in terms of proportion, but didn't quite get that right, which is okay. Now, template areas. Remember I said CSS grid uses template areas where it's going to name certain things to say, by the way, this element should belong here, and we're going to snap it together like little Lego blocks. So nav and main, not really what I want, but let's go navigation, content. I'm going to name these things a little bit different. And footer, it actually nailed that. So this is kind of, to me, this is like weird syntax, to be honest with you. I don't know if we need a width, so we'll slam a width here anyway. This is kind of odd syntax here where this represents the layout of our page. For those of you that don't know CSS grid, where I'm saying, okay, on this row, I got navigation and content. And on this row, it's footer and footer, which will essentially do this. But you see how it's taken my kind of text or my comments, and it's translated it into code. That's pretty cool. I got a little layer here happening. I'm going to lean on my IDE to import style components in here. And we're going to go with shell container. So let's not kind of bounce back and forth between what it looks like right now. But, really what we want to do is we want to start. So, you see how it kind of guessed, given our context so far, it's saying, okay, within your shell, you mentioned you wanted navigation. So as you started typing, I'm going to kind of guess what you wanted. And we got some content and we got footer. So it's kind of really helping me out, and it's learning as I'm kind of building this thing out, right? So that's pretty good. Now we're kind of we're gonna grow out navigation. So it's suggesting I want to do a style div, which I don't yet. Okay, you know what? We'll do the container. It really wants to do this. But you see how it automatically recognized my pattern and started to finish the naming for me, which is pretty cool. And it's recognizing the syntax. You're using CSS grid based off of our template areas. It's saying, hey, I think you want this grid area to be navigation, which is correct. And I don't know, let's go background color. Let's just go red for now. And we're going to create the navigation, essentially our sidebar. Now it knows I'm in a React component functional, which is pretty cool. And it goes, oh, I recognize your pattern that you typically, wrap something in its container if it's named the same. So I want this. I'm going to do that. And we're going to get rid of this and put in navigation. Okay, maybe, I think the important parts here that you're seeing is how Copilot is taking context from my current page and actually helping us do some things. So I'm going to add a comment in here, and I'm going to say, do the same for content and footer. For navigation and navigation container. Okay, so it doesn't really care about spelling. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to see if it can finish this off for us, right? I don't do the least amount of typing, kind of pattern this sucker up. So it's not really doing anything. So I'm going to give it a hint. And so it's going to go, okay, let's go const container. That seems correct to me. Once again, the important part here is that Copilot recognized, that I'm trying to create something that's targeted towards the grid area content based off of the name. And it changed my background color to blue, which is interesting, right? I said red, kind of gave me a different background color. Okay. And I'm just going to now it's just kind of knows my pattern, right? So footer, I'm just going to let the sucker go. Tabbing my way to success, going to be that 10 times developer always wanted to be. Okay. So it's basically done this for us, right? Actually changed footer to green, which is kind of neat. And I'm going to get rid of all of this. All right. Let's see what our app is looking like. Oh, pretty sweet. Pretty sweet indeed. Looks like for those of you that are old enough to recognize this is like the test pattern that goes on TV. after the broadcast day. Not necessarily, something we want to live with, but it sure identifies our layout that we wanted. Okay, we're going to do, I'm kind of checking the time here. Quickly, what I think we're going to do is I really want to get into Copilot chat. So what we've been using here is Copilot as a whole, okay, just within my IDE. And I remember I said GitHub Copilot chat kind of came about. And it's really this kind of, this is Chat GPT inside of the IDE. Okay, so in addition to being able to write context, comments and have it kind of guess your code, now I can sit here and once I have this new extension, kind of in my IDE, I basically have Chat GPT with specifically targeted towards coding, inside of my IDE. And anytime I can stay inside my IDE, I can, stay in the zone, not be distracted, trying to figure out how to fix my golf slice or something like that. But, it's really I'm going to stay here and I'm going to stay focused. And the nice thing about this versus, let's say, using Chat GPT, which I usually have off to the side in another browser tab, is that it has, that same kind of context that Copilot does inside of here. Okay, so let's just kind of see this a little bit in action where, I don't know, I can, let's say we wanted to center this content, right? So we want to create something. So we're going to say, create a style component. That centers items horizontally and vertically. Okay. We can hammer this out and, so right here, it kind of, the interesting thing, right, is it gave me like a full kind of standalone version of this, but it did recognize, once again, my naming conventions and took a guess at this, which is pretty awesome. And yeah, we're going to work with this, right? So what we're going to do is when it kind of gives you these kind of examples here, and you can go back and forth with this to kind of fine tune things, or like, so for example, I don't want this height. I don't know, for whatever reason, I'll say remove height. And wow, this came up with nothing that we wanted. This is the fun part about, some of these things with these generative AIs, and it probably because of my prompt, I should have said removed height from centered container, but this is the learning experience. So this is real, but this is kind of what we want. And when it generates code for us, we have the option to say, okay, I want to insert this at the cursor. I want to copy this. I want to put this into a new file or run into a terminal. But, the important part about having Copilot chat inside your IDE, right, is if you've ever gone and you've used Chat GPT as your, I don't know, rubber ducky, right, where, I don't know if everyone's familiar with this concept, but sometimes you're stuck on a problem. It's nice to talk things through with somebody, give them some context and help solve the problem. Just bouncing it, talking to a little rubber ducky on your desk. This can take that place, inside of your IDE. Okay. So you know what? I'm going to insert this in here, even though it's going to cause some errors, but it's good enough for me for now. And we'll get rid of some duplication. But I really like the name that it gave, kind of what I was looking for. And what I kind of want to do, so in addition to having this kind of chat on the side, you'll notice it takes up a bit of space, right? So I'm still constrained with some space. So Copilot Chat, what they've done is they recognize that. And you can kind of go through here and you could say this content container. Like I said, I know enough that, hey, with style components, I can take an existing component and extend it. Okay. So I'm going to highlight this little bit of code. And there is some, you know, a little quick keystroke here, Command I. And what we're going to do is, as opposed to like work in the right-hand side where our chat is, I can actually ask it in line, right? So I'm going to say, extend this, and you know, I can't quite remember the syntax. Extend this from centered container. And the interesting thing about chat is what it's going to do is it's going to pop in a diff editor right away, right? To say, hey, here's your current code. Here's what you asked me. This is the code I'm proposing, which is pretty darn cool, right? And just kind of looking at this, I believe this is the correct syntax, and I have the options to accept or discard. So, you know, pretty neat, pretty powerful. And, you know, it's, you still have, I guess the biggest thing to understand here as we go through this too, is it's not like Copilot is going to replace you at any time, but it sure is going to augment your productivity. Right? So then I'm going to say, you're going to accept this because you still have to know some information, and you've got to be able to understand if it's giving you, you know, things you're kind of looking for or completely wrong. So that's pretty good. What else can we say about Copilot Chat? You know, so you got the window on the side, and as you're kind of answering things and you kind of keep on going, it's going to use this whole area for context as well, right? So similar to ChatGPT, it's kind of going to run in using previous, you know, the previous conversation as context and go forward. You know, sometimes though, you just want to ask it a random question that maybe you don't want it to influence anything else. So in addition to doing some inline kind of suggestions, there's another quick command, you know, and it pops up at the top here. You know, on my keyboard, it's Shift Command I. I run a Mac. You know, and then I can ask things that don't necessarily have context. This is like a new kind of just general question. And, you know, I could say, what is the weather today? And remember what I said is that this model is specifically trained just for programming related questions. So if you want to use ChatGPT, or if you think this is going to replace it for your other conversations, you still got to go outside. This is literally just coding. The model just understands coding. But I really like the way, you know, the tool has kind of given you options on how you can use Copilot. I can use it on the, you know, set up my ID any way I want to have this conversation. I can just ask random questions, or I can use it right inside of my code editor. Okay.
Michael, I want to add real quick. I love this integration. It seems so smooth and seamless. I did have a question myself, and I do encourage anyone on the call, if you have questions, please ask. But as far as like debugging an existing issue in your code, does it work well with that too? Oh, go ahead.
Great question. So let's say I added, I don't know, very simple kind of thing here, right? Where I got a lot of angry red, right? It's kind of, so with Copilot Chat, and I'm starting to see this in servicing Copilot, GitHub Copilot, that plugin is constantly updating and making things available. So, you know, what you can do is you're going to see this fix using Copilot now pop up with quick fix items. So you can use that. Another thing I might do is, because I have chat in here, and once again, chat's just in preview mode, not fully released yet. Whoop. I can go inside here, right? Bring up our specific context chat for this. And it has a bunch of predetermined kind of, I could type out, hey, fix this, or I can give it a command, right? To say fix, and we'll see what it comes up with. And once again, it kind of went into that ability to say, hey, here's your, diff, here's your current code, and here's the recommended code. Now, this was a pretty simple fix, but this is an idea of where, Copilot can help you with your problems. Did that answer kind of your question, Jordan?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, you know what? We have about 15 minutes left. I'm gonna do one more example. I don't know how good it's gonna go, but let's see where it goes. And you kind of hear, and there's a lot of content on the web about GitHub Copilot and its functionality, but you hear a lot about unit tests. So let's kind of see what this thing can do. And I'm going to use chat. I'm going to clear all this. I have a little API folder that, I've actually, you can see I've used Copilot to kind of create this stuff for me, gave it some comments like we've just shown, and kind of said, create me some stuff. Oh, we got a console log. That's dirty. Oh boy. Okay, so let's just let's say, I got to write some unit tests. So let's see how this thing can hammer out some unit tests. So we're going to say create unit tests for these functions, mocking out fetch, and verifying. We want to verify. The correct endpoint was called. And I want to make sure we using settings to get the endpoint. Okay, who knows what we're going to get? Well, let's see. This actually looks pretty good. Let's expand this out. So once again, because of the current file I'm on, it has that context, sending it out. So it's going to use just mock, mocked out the entire fetch operation. Ooh, replaced global. I guess you probably have to with fetch. But fundamentally, if I kind of look at this, it looks okay. So it looks like it's asserting the correct endpoint, right? I expect my mock fetch to have been called with /customers off the base URL, and translate order calls the correct endpoint. You know what? This looks pretty good. But once again, right, like this is the power of this stuff, to remember all the syntax as we jump around. Like we jumped around from CSS, to style components, to React, to TypeScript, to Jest. And I use it for a lot. I've used it in a lot of back-end programming with C#. We've even had to help me crank out some YAML files. Once again, I've used it in Azure Data Studio because my SQL Kung Fu is a little lower than it used to be, given that, we have all these fancy ORMs and everything these days. So yeah, it's really helped me try to remember and keep all the syntax in my mind as opposed to cruising around on the web. But this actually looks not too bad. I don't know if I'm brave enough to run this right now, but if I wanted to, we would say, okay, create this as another file, and we'd let it rip. All right, so we have 10 minutes left, and I want to leave some time just at the end too for Jordan. So that's kind of it for the demo. Went not too bad. I mean, pretty much it kind of behaved as I expected. Gave me a couple weird answers, but pretty good. And the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about, just very quickly, is what's coming up with Copilot. So as I mentioned, we had a look at Copilot Chat, which is now released in preview. And with GitHub Copilot X, the X kind of stands for all these new features they're going to continually adding on. And so, and there's wait lists for all of these right now, so they're not actually publicly available, but chat is now in preview. So that looks pretty solid. It's integrated well. It's currently only available in VS Code. It won't be long until it's available for other tools like, like what I hope, JetBrains, things like that. But some other things coming down the pipe are pull requests, and I've watched some videos on this, and this is pretty interesting, where based off of the code that you've changed, it will, and a template you provide, it will kind of cruise through all your changes and generate a pull request, a documented pull request for you, which was pretty handy. And the other interesting thing too is as you get feedback from your approvers, they may suggest coding changes, things like that. Well, just like I showed you with Copilot Chat, you can go /fix, and it can actually start to incorporate suggestions from other approvers into your code as you're going, which is kind of cool. The other thing, CLI, right? Like coming to a terminal near you, so many CLI commands, right? It sure would be nice to have a little Copilot with me to help me figure those out. That one's coming. Documents, documents in general, like Copilot is going to help you like directly be involved with, let's say we talked about style components, the style component documentation, right, with inside your IDE. Once again, you don't have to jump away, but it's tied directly into the documents, the latest and greatest documents from your, any libraries that you're using. And, voice is pretty cool. This is like straight out of, I don't know if anyone's heard of this one, but this one's like, straight out of Iron Man with Tony Stark and Jarvis, where, I could just be talking, right? And Copilot I'll be having a conversation with Copilot versus typing on the keyboard to actually start to generate code. So there's probably a lot more that are coming down the pipe. But this is just some snippets of some things that are down the road. So yeah, I think timing wise, I think this is kind of, let's just stop here and I'll pass it back to Jordan.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the wonderful talk. Actually, I have a lot of questions. I love AI, ML has been very interesting to me recently. My last question for you is, do you see any area where GitHub Copilot isn't strong or powerful, or where it might get confused, or has the integration been pretty seamless for you?
It actually has been very good. It's similar to ChatGPT if you ever work with it. Every once in a while it gets delusional, right? And I've totally seen it, and then I'm just like, okay, like, and then it's a challenge of how do I reset it to get it back on track, right? So definitely it still happens, and it happens more often in the chat, right? The chat feature, as you kind of saw, we saw a little bit of it where I said, okay, removed height. And for some reason, it could have been my prompt, but it went down and it removed height from the wrong thing. But yeah, I've kind of bounced stuff back and forth and it just goes off the rails for sure.
I
Yeah.
know it every once in a while it mixes up the context or something like that. I saw a post about ChatGPT a while ago where someone told it it can only speak in emojis, and it just broke the whole chat conversation. It
Right.
was crazy. But it's really interesting to see how these are starting to get integrated into our lives, what those impacts are. A lot of them, I personally, it's very subjective, but I think a lot of those impacts are going to be helpful in a lot of different aspects of what we do in our day to day.
I think so too. And you know what? I just noticed the comments here and I saw someone comment on helps me with Rust being a newbie. And yeah, I find this is a great way because like I said, I jump around and I find myself in all kinds of weird spots that I just don't, I'm like, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. And
Right.
to have something like this as a sounding board to help you get over some hurdles. And I didn't explain something or I didn't show this feature, but the other thing you can do is, you can highlight a piece of code and you can say, explain this for me, right?
Oh,
And it will actually give you a rundown of what's happening there to help you through some code, even if it's like, you're working on some legacy code and it may be, it's like, oh, this is interesting, right? What's happening here? It'll summarize it for you.
that's really cool. There's this one library I've been using ChatGPT for a lot. The syntax for it's very confusing. And I've read through the documentation, but I use it so far and few between that. Every time it comes back up, it's like I forgot everything. And I throw the prompt into ChatGPT and say, hey, create this for me. I needed to do this, this, and that. And it's one line of just like random text, it looks like, but it does something very important. And when I look back at the previous ones, I have to leave strong comments because I'll never be able to decipher them. But this would be
Totally.
super helpful for looking into that.
Totally. And for some reason, my mind goes to regular expressions.
Very similar to that. It's a small like web scraper I built that it has to look for certain like elements and stuff like that and then pull information from that, and it gets very messy very quickly. But I know we're coming up just a couple more minutes here. Did you have any other closing statements or anything like that?
Not really. I mean, outside of, I would love to hear anyone else's experience. Feel free to reach out, or any other tools that are in this space too. Because yeah, this is, I kind of look at it as, this may be, the beginning of the year was probably, it's kind of a weird phrase, but the worst it will ever be.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's only going to get better.
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of progress to be made, and there's a lot of great ideas that are starting to be implemented. We're just barely scratching the surface with it all. But
Totally. Yeah.
but anyway, thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate you joining the call. If this talk interested you, definitely check out our next talk next week. It's another continuation on AI, titled AI Ethics in the Real World. Devlin Lyles, our Chief Consulting Officer, will be talking about the impacts of AI, where it's going, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. Kind of not so much code related, I think, but how it impacts society. So I'll definitely be on that call, and I hope to see everyone else there as well. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, everybody.